Hails and well met, fellow adventurers, and welcome to RPG Tales Told, where we regale stories of adventure and heroism, and also fun and entertaining accounts from tabletops everywhere. Shall we begin? Today's tale picks up where we left off last time. Chapter 1, James. It was dark. For some reason, that particular thought dominated James's mind. His whole body felt heavy and fuzzy, as if he'd drunk too much. Hard to focus. He couldn't seem to make himself move, even to open his eyes. Were his eyes closed? What had he been? The thought vanished, replaced by a crushing wave of dizziness. His chest felt tight, painfully tight. The sensation of falling. Air. Breathe. Breathe! Whiteness. Relief. His building panic evaporated. That falling sensation again. Breathe! Air rushed into James's lungs. The world slowly regained focus around him, and his eyes widened. The first thing that struck him was the air. It had a richer quality to it, almost as if it were thicker than normal air. He could smell the combination of sweat, ale, cooked meat, and leather permeating the air. Noise flooded his ears, and he put his head down as his brain struggled to process it. To process anything. Deep breaths, in and out. It was okay. He was just having a really vivid dream. Nothing to be alarmed about. The wood of the table felt coarse and firm under his hands. The chair beneath him creaked as he shifted. Slowly, James looked up. "You all meet in a tavern." The words came from everywhere at once, along with the compulsion too. He noticed for the first time that he wasn't alone at the table. "Oh my god, effing bad ace." The speaker was an absurdly hot girl sitting across from him. Her elegant features were displaying a stunningly beautiful grin. Her large, ruby-colored eyes wide as she gawked. He'd never seen such long, beautiful hair, silver and gold, and she was an elf. The compulsion urged his gaze to the right. The figure seated there had his head on the table, hands covering it. James could hear rapid muttering coming from him, the sounds of which were both incomprehensible and deeply disturbing. He couldn't make out the figure's face from behind a veil of blonde hair, but his build was slight and sort of bony. To the left now, as his eyes passed back over the elf girl, he couldn't help but smile. But it rapidly morphed into one of dismay, as if in stark contrast, the dwarf sitting there was one of the ugliest people he'd ever seen. He had scraggly bright red hair everywhere, a face covered with a large tattoo of some poorly depicted creature, and a frame that was so grotesquely muscular he resembled one of those muscle power models. He looked as confused as James felt, his bright blue eyes slipping in and out of focus. James's head continued to throb, the cacophony of the surrounding tavern pressing in on him. Parts of what he was hearing was incomprehensible gibberish, but some of it he could understand. English? Sounded like it. He didn't recognize the other language, though. He allowed himself to look beyond the table, taking in the room properly. It seemed every bit to be a genuine fantasy tavern. Some of the patrons were definitely not human. His breath came in a shuddering gasp, and he closed his eyes. Just a dream. A very, very vivid dream. "Hey!" James's eyes snapped open to find the elf girl leaning over the table in his direction, her dress revealing an expanse of creamy, pale cleavage. He quickly adjusted his gaze, head flooding his face. She smirked, then settled back into her seat. The heady, minty scent of her lingered in the air. "Good, you're awake. The others seem kind of out of it, especially him." She nodded towards the muttering figure to his right. "Aye," James began, then lapsed into silence. "Guess I'll go first then," she said cheerfully. "I'm an elementalist specializing in healing. Lyra Sunwalker, at your service." "You're an elementalist?" She nodded smugly. I know. My selflessness is legendary. The world around him spun a little more violently. His mouth felt dry.
Leon?
She wagged a finger at him. Lyra. She leaned towards him again, lifting a small hand to cup delicately around her mouth. Stay in character, noob. The hammering in his chest grew as she winked and withdrew. He couldn't. He felt his hands brace against the table. His body felt limp and numb. Come on, it's your turn. Don't leave me hanging, bro. Leon, or was it Lyra, gestured towards the others at the table. He's been doing that creepy muttering since I woke, and you just came too. Dwarf McUggo there is still doing the 1,000-yard stare thing, so I'm guessing his train is still boarding at the station.
Leon?
Lyra, she chirped.
What the F ever?
He pounded his fist on the table hard enough to make them hurt.
What the heck is wrong with you? Aren't you freaked out?
I was a little at first, but I've got a good feeling about this. Her grin grew even wider, gaining a slightly manic touch. I mean, seriously, isn't this amazing? Why the butt hurt? Just relax, bro, and I know everything will be cool.
Oh, God.
James lowered his head into his hands. The feeling of dread which had been growing in the pit of his stomach finally enveloped him. If this wasn't a dream, then it was real. Somehow he'd been sucked into his DM's poopy homebrew.
No, this can't be happening. There's got to be some sort of escape hatch. I can't be trapped in here.
Across the table, Leon started coughing, a practiced yet delicate sound. Might as well accept it, dude, she managed between bouts. Hoo-ah, this is some good stuff. James looked up incredulously. Leon was tapping out an intricately designed wooden pipe, blowing into it before reloading it from a small leather pouch.
Are you doing drugs?
It's not a drug, it's an herb. He shook his head in dismay.
Really? Really? Where did you even get that stuff?
Pipe? A gruff voice to his left said thickly. The dwarf's eyes were now in focus, although he still looked just as confused. He kept blinking and rubbing his forehead. He held out his hand towards Leon, stubby dwarven fingers covered with calluses. Leon slowly nodded and complied.
No, not you too.
James protested. Bro. Leon's brilliantly red eyes flashed in warning, a soft glow visible somewhere within them. I'm the healer. Let me do my job. She gently placed the pipe into the dwarf's hand. I'll light it when you're ready. The dwarf obligingly raised the piece, but didn't seem able to get his mass of hair out of the way. Leon finally leaned over and assisted him, frowning softly to herself. Suddenly, a tiny tongue of flame materialized over her finger, flowing and flickering through the air into the small green bud sitting in the pipe. James sat back hard. Magic. What did he know about magic in Alan's homebrew? Nothing. He had looked over the spells and casting classes, but he couldn't seem to recall any specifics. Something about that was wrong. He had been very thorough. He should remember something.
Name a level 1 spell I know,
he murmured to himself, racking his brain.
Magic. Ray. Of.
The knowledge just sat beyond the grasp of his memory, and the harder he tried to reach it, the harder his head hurt. Beside him, the dwarf began coughing. Leon slapped him on the back. There you go, buddy. You're gonna be fine. You're gonna be fine. James finally took a long look at the dwarf.
I guess your will?
The dwarf hesitated in a long moment before nodding. Well. So you know who that would make our crazed friend? Leon gestured towards the fourth member of their party. James nodded.
Dan.
He's a wizard, right? That's what he settled on.
Yeah.
The unnerving noises issuing from his friend had taken on the quality of a chant.
He's been like this the whole time?
Leon's smile faded. He was awake before me, but how long I don't know. James steeled himself and reached towards Dan. His fingers closed on thin, bony shoulders, but otherwise nothing happened. He inwardly chided himself. What had he been expecting? Dan continued to mutter to himself in some brain-bending language. His fingers clenched around his head like claws.
What do?
Will grunted. There was something hopeless in his voice that stole any reply James might have made. The silence at the table lingered, filled almost exclusively by Dan's frenzied whispering. His voice was hoarse, but the flow continued unabated. Hearing it made James shudder. Shreds of meaning crept into his brain only to be immediately forgotten. Some of those noises were never meant to be made by humans. I think we should take a quest. His eyes settled on Leon.
What?
He asked with barely restrained anger. Leon shrugged. It feels like the thing to do, doesn't it? James shook his head.
You really are a stupid a-hole. We need to be figuring out how to get out of here, not going on adventures. I don't know about you, but I've got a life back home. I have a job, a fiancé, college loans to pay off. I can't be here.
Oh, well then why don't you explain how to get back? I'm all ears. Leon's scowl lasted for a few seconds before she burst into manic laughter. Get it? Because I'm an elf. The noise drew some scowls from nearby patrons, but James could only stare incredulously. With a single motion, he flowed out of his seat, his hands going to his sides he stepped into the world outside the tavern, knuckles white as they clenched beside the handles of his daggers. Emerging from the stale air of the tavern was like surfacing from underwater, and he was immediately struck by the cool, crisp quality of it. Being in his character's body felt strange. His real body was larger, but his movements were now much faster than what he was used to, and he seemed to move on instinct now, what he'd almost just done. He stumbled away from the street into a nearby alley. The reek of refuse heat permeated the corridor, pushing his stomach one step too far. He threw up stomach acid, then dry heaved for minute after minute, his head throbbing painfully through. This was all wrong. What was he supposed to do? He hadn't asked for this. Somehow this was Alan's fault. He wasn't sure how, but he'd figure it out. He'd get home. He had to. He'd do it if he had to tear Alan's stupid homebrew down around his ears. If Leon doesn't want to help, then F him. He was going to get home no matter what the cost, even if he had to ditch Leon's dumb self. He wiped his mouth on his sleeve of his shirt, noticing that it was far more rough spun than anything he was used to. Itchy. Yeah, F this world. We shall have to continue this tale in the next chapter. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you were entertained. Please consider liking, subscribing, and ringing the bell of notifications.